Hello and welcome to another episode of Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. My name's Ian Glacken. I'm an executive consultant at Snowden Optiro here in Perth. Today, this is the first of a two-part series, and we're going to be talking about mineral resource estimation or classification strategies. We're going to give you a view of current practice, good practice. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Graeme Lyall. Graeme's an executive consultant at Snowden Optiro based in Santiago, although you may detect a slight Scottish accent there. Graeme's very experienced and has done a lot of work in this area. So let me, before we get stuck into the Graeme's ideas, let me spend a little bit of time framing the topic. Resource classification is one of the things that's fairly consistent across just about all the codes, whether we're talking about Canada, Chile, South Africa, England, the US, Australia, of course. The only ones that are different is the Chinese code, such as it is, and the Russian code. In other words, they all have the same definitions, more or less, almost always, of indicated, inferred, and measured. So those definitions, I don't think I need to go into them, but essentially the inferred material has the least confidence. Indicated and measured material is that which can convert to mineral reserves or ore reserves, so it has more confidence, and measured is the highest level of confidence. I think most people watching this will understand that. We don't need to have measured resources for a reserve, and some mines never have measured resources. So I think let's not focus on that, but let's focus on how we would actually take our blocks in our model and classify them into those three categories or two categories or whatever. Before we just get started, I just want to introduce, because it's relevant to this podcast, this idea of what we call the 90-15 approach. Now, we'll talk about this in the second podcast in more detail, but before Graeme gets stuck into some of the techniques we're going to talk about, it's important to understand this 90-15 approach. It's an approach that was put forward by Christina Dong and Harry Parker in about the 90s and the noughties. So it's sort of developed. And I would say that it's fairly common among most major companies, not so much juniors, but major companies. And the idea is that we're trying to define material using a confidence interval. That's the 90% confidence interval. We're trying to define material with a certain error, 15% error. And we're looking at parcels that relate to the production, whether it's 3 months production or 1 month production. So that's the essence of the 90-15, and that will be important to what Graeme is going to talk about. I should just say what we're not going to talk about in this podcast, and this is the definition of a competent or a qualified person. I think there are people who have know a lot more about this than we do, and who have written books on this topic. So we're not going to cover that. And the other thing we're not going to cover is this idea of reasonable prospects of eventual economic extraction. We've covered this. I've covered this in at least 2 more podcasts previously, and I'm not going to go and rant about it there. So really what we're going to talk about here is the mechanics of classification, the criteria, what goes into the model, and what we're going to how we're going to decide what category to use. Final thing I just want to talk about is this idea of the spotted dog. The spotted dog is quite a famous concept, and the idea is that when you apply a formula to your classification based on whatever, and we can talk about that, if you end up with this idea of very patchy classification, which is totally impractical from a mining point of view. So whichever classification method we talk about, we need to be very much aware of this spotted dog effect. In other words, we need to post-process our estimates to get rid of that. Okay, so final thing to say before I ask Graeme a question is that this idea of drill spacing, using just drill spacing, it's still very common and popular. I think it's important to understand that there are techniques that are more rigorous than just drill spacing. And finally, I just want to say that we're not presenting new methods. We're providing a review of current practices. So Graeme, let's talk about drill spacing. And what's the best way, the most rigorous way of determining the average drill spacing in a block model? How would we do that? How could we do that?
Well, I guess it's in practical terms, drill spacing is never a regular grid.
Sure.
So if it were regular, it would be pretty simple to outline areas of different drill spacing. So you've got irregular drill grids, and you have to find sort of way of calibrating your resource model to reflect that drill hole spacing. So you can actually approximate what they call the equivalent grid using search-based criteria, and basically spatially map the average drill hole spacing in your block model. And one approach to this is actually to that is commonly used is actually to use the average distance to the nearest 3 holes, and then you multiply this by the square root of 2. And this is based on geometrical considerations, and it's commonly applied by many companies. And personally, I've used this quite a few times, and after reviewing sections and plans of the results and looking at the drill hole intercepts, it seems to work pretty well.
Yeah.
And the final result is actually, it delivers in general fairly continuous volumes. It with the right number of intercepts in those volumes, and it sort of avoids the typical, what you were mentioning previous, the spotted dog outcomes, the things that, and if there is any discontinuities in the classification, you can actually, or in the grid spacing mapping, you can actually post-process this quite simply using some sort of moving average, and that's not something that's very difficult to implement either.
A smoothing type approach. So I guess what we're saying here is that we're not saying don't use the drill spacing, absolutely not. What we are saying is you should use the drill spacing in using the technique that Graeme described, and I would concur that is effectively an industry standard. But then that should be the starting point for your classification. So what alternatives are there to that, Graeme, if you're not able to do that for whatever reason?
The drill spacing. There are alternatives to mapping. I mean, in the old days, I used to use a kriging variance. So kriging variance is another parameter that you can use to sort of map the information effect or the drill or the information spacing in your model. But when you actually use Krieg variance, you tend to get these, exactly what we want to avoid is these tubes along the holes, which if you look at it in cross section, you start getting this Dalmatian spotted dog type thing. So if you use Krieg spacing, you're always going to have to post process that using some sort of smoothing algorithm. But there are, it's a way around. And for that same reason, I prefer using the very much simpler 3 drill hole approach, which it's simpler and it's easy to apply. So I would go along with that.
Sure. Yeah. What I would say, and this is maybe an obvious statement, is that it's quite possible to have a very close drill spacing and still have very poor confidence, and that could be because of the geological or the mineralogical nature of the mineralization. So if you have a high nugget effect, I mean, you could have a 5x5 drill spacing and it will not be measured, it will never be measured or indicated even. So really it's important to understand, as Graeme said, that the drill spacing, the equivalent grid is a component of the estimation process. Okay, so Graeme, let's talk about another approach, which I know you're very familiar with. This is the 2 indicator approach. What's the history and how were you involved with that?
Okay, so yes, I was first introduced to this approach in the early 90s, working in a mineral resource team with Anglo American in Santiago, Chile. And at that time, we worked very closely with Harry Parker. Harry Parker, he'd founded a mineral resource estimation advisory group called Mineral Resource Development Incorporated, MRDI. And I don't think Dr. Parker requires any introduction. He's got his career and reputation has distinguished him above many others. Sadly, he's not with us any longer. He passed away in 2019, but his contributions remain very much still alive. I think Dr. Parker pioneered all this 90-15 approach. This was well before anything was actually published on it. Right. He published maybe 2014 or 2004 Ina Dom, and then 2014 with Verley. But before that, he'd been working through his consulting and giving advisory and pushing this approach, which he really did pioneer. And I guess it was early 90s when I was working on the resource evaluation of Salobo, which is a big IOCG in Brazil. At that time, it was a JV between CVRD, which is Vale now, and Anglo-American. Anglo-American then pulled out of that. But anyway, so we were doing the resource evaluation. Dr. Parker was assisting us, and he basically introduced us to his two-indicator approach.
So what is the essence of that approach? How does it work?
Yeah, and at the time he gave us this simple recipe. It's like a one-pager that I still have to the day of today, and I still refer to it. But yeah, the essence basically you've got these two indicators which are calculated on sample composites. He's defined these a tonnage indicator and a metal indicator. The tonnage indicator is 0 if it's less than cutoff, and it's 1 if it's above cutoff. And the metal indicator on the other hand is something similar. It's 0 if it's less cutoff, and it's your grade if it's above cutoff.
Right.
And so the idea, the tonnage indicators sort of represents uncertainty in outlining your geological units, or basically what's above cutoff, and the metal indicator is more in relation to the grade above cutoff.
So you would essentially estimate these two variables,
yeah,
and then use that for classification.
Yeah, so we estimate these two variables, and I guess the relation between the two, you divide metal by tons, and you've got the uncertainty in the grade. But we estimate these two variables into large blocks. We'd use some formalism from Journal, Mining Geostats, 1978 book that tells you how to combine the variance of these two indicators and basically calculate your confidence intervals. And you would do this for, as you were mentioning previously, you would do this on large production units. So for measured, you might consider a quarterly production unit or a volume of that size. Yeah. And for indicated, you normally consider annual production units. Sure. So these are large blocks. And you do this for several grid spacings on your large blocks, and then you'd select the grid spacing that corresponds to your 15% error at a 90% confidence interval. That 15% error is basically saying that if you've got 10 years, 9 of those 10 years are likely to have an error less than 15%. And one of those might fall out. And that is normally an acceptable level of uncertainty for annual cash flows in a feasibility or pre-feasibility study.
So what are the assumptions and the shortcomings of this two-indicator approach?
I guess one of the main assumptions is that the errors are, is the norm, your assumption of a normal distribution of errors within these large blocks, and that's normally reasonable considering that the blocks are large, and that you're under the assumption that on averaging several samples in large blocks, that the central limit theorem applies. I guess some of the limitations I've had, at least trying to apply this to very large mines. If you think of, in my case, Collahuasi, which is the second largest copper producer in the world, you're talking about production units which are huge. If you look at Escondida, which is the largest copper mine in the world, they're processing 400,000 tons a day. That's nearly 500,000 tons a day. That means in a year, they're actually processing 150 million tons in 1 year. And, 150 million tons, it's like processing a big-sized mine in one year,
That's
you know,
right.
and Escondia is doing that in 1 year. So some of those production units, when you start applying this theory, they become extremely high, and that reduces your error. So you might, and if the variance is not too large, it may, the results you get is drill hole spacings that may seem, you know, over optimistic, very wide, and that's when you have to apply a bit of common sense, and maybe you in those cases you have to be a bit more restrictive. Instead of using a 90-10 rule, perhaps be more restrictive, use a 90-15.
Yeah.
You probably move to a 90-10, or you probably move to reducing the size of your production unit.
Okay, great. So what I would say, just in closing, two points. The first point is that this approach, which is widely used, particularly in South America, it didn't require any techniques like simulation.
Yeah.
It was in the era before simulation. So what I would say these days is that we do have this very powerful technique called simulation, which can be used in a similar way, and we'll talk about that in the second part of this podcast series. The other point I'd make is that, and this applies to any technique, it's a starting point for the classification. And the competent person, the qualified person, needs to then apply his or her overlay based on things like geological confidence, grade confidence, and things like that. So these approaches, which are very reasonable, are simply the starting point.
And if I could add something that perhaps I missed, is that that whilst this approach worked relatively well for, you know, porphyries and IOCG disseminated type deposits, it may not work. I think it may not work in other types of deposits. So,
Sure.
So if you're looking at iron ore, where the variability is very low, maybe you have to look at impurities rather than the ore grade. If you're looking at other nickel laterites, where, you know, once you're in the, for a wet laterite, once you're in the saprolite unit, your grades are actually quite continuous. You know, the uncertainty on that grade is not so much.
Yeah.
You have to look at probably geological uncertainty and geological factors, which is maybe the thickness or the irregularity of that saprolite unit.
Yeah.
And that is going to require a different approach. I suppose what you're mentioning is, you know, using other approaches, simulation, stuff like that, could lead you in that way.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say is that, you know, if you're dealing with, say, structurally hosted gold deposit with a relatively high negative effect, this approach isn't necessarily going to work. So it's an option that definitely has worked and does work, but you need to consider the style of deposit that you're looking at. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Graeme.
Okay.
So thank you for listening or watching. This is the first of a two-part series, as I mentioned. The second part, we'll get into a few more techniques. We'll talk a bit more about the 90-15 technique, and we'll talk in general terms about what we call the scorecard approach. If you enjoy this podcast, please hit the subscribe button. Please subscribe to our podcasts. We produce them every week, and we're found where all good podcasts are found. Thank you very much.